Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with a story, Hallowed Ground Part 2, penned by the twisted mind of the Vespers Bell. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow fear fanatics and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us, so feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, Hallowed Ground, Part 2. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. So, after I told you all about the strange experience I had in my little cemetery, a few of you wanted to know how my Halloween party went. Better than the last one. Thank you very much. Don't worry, I'm joking. I am going to tell you what happened. But before I do, I need to tell you more about my year in between the last two Halloweens. Otherwise, it just wouldn't make any sense. Hopefully, you'll find it as interesting as I did, and I'll spread it across a few chapters to make it easier to digest. But I promise you, this story does have a resolution, and we will get to it. As you already know, the night the man died, I was stuck inside a ring of jack-o'-lanterns, surrounded by formless spirits he called wisps. They couldn't pass over the circle he'd made, but they seemed to be aware of my presence. After they had devoured the man, they started orbiting around me, forming a pillar of cold blue flames that spiraled up into the night sky, until I couldn't tell them apart from the stars. If I hadn't just watched them kill my friend, it would have been beautiful. Nothing caught in their ghostly light made a shadow, and yet there were shadows. Shadows of things that weren't there, things that didn't or couldn't exist in the natural world. Even though I was hysterical, I was cognizant enough to think that the shadows were of things on the other side of the veil, where the man said the wisps were from, and that the wisps were still not fully in our world, and so their light was obstructed from the other side. At the time, I didn't know if the shadows were just horrifically distorted, or if they were accurate representations of horrifically distorted creatures. Since there was nothing I could do to fend them off anyway, I just closed my eyes and tried to wait for it to be over. That's when I realized that mixed in with the howling of the wind was an uncanny choir of ethereal voices. It was faint, and if there were any words, they weren't English, but I could tell that they weren't coming from the wisps, but from across the veil. I almost had a heart attack then, fighting my body's nearly overwhelming fight or flight response, knowing that staying put was my only chance for survival. As I listened to the voices, I came to realize that they weren't directed at me. If the things on the other side of the veil knew I was there, they didn't care. Their music was in celebration, a Halloween celebration that dwarfed mine by 1,000 orders of magnitude. A vague sort of image started to form in my mind, of a grand festival dedicated to the most sacred night of the year. In my horror, I wondered what could possibly give these ghastly beings cause for such jubilation. To my dismay, something on their side chose to answer me in a nigh inaudible whisper that my panicked mind just barely managed to parse meaning from. All Hallows Eve marks the return of our queen, Persephone. Around midnight, the wisps and voices disappeared, and the world seemed normal again, if hopelessly dark and silent. With nothing now to light my way but the candles of the jack-o'-lanterns, I dashed to my car and sped out of the cemetery, letting all the party supplies I had placed on the hood fly off where they would. It was pitch black that night, and I was in no state to be driving, let alone as fast as I was. But I somehow made it home in one piece. I locked myself in my apartment, took a Xanax, and without getting undressed, I crawled into bed with my cat and cried myself to sleep. I took more of my Xanax than I should have over the next week, but I had no idea how else to cope with my experience. Not only had I watched someone's violent death and been put in mortal danger myself, but I'd also come into contact with some kind of spirit world, possibly the underworld of Greek mythology. I honestly think the only reason I didn't have any suicidal ideation was because that would have just taken me straight to what I was running from. It had been psychologically and existentially traumatic, and I didn't think I could tell anyone about it. No one would believe me. And if someone started snooping around the graveyard, I might be implicated in the man's death. And on top of that, I also mourned the loss of the cemetery. I loved that cemetery. It was perfect, but I told myself that it was dangerous and that I could never go back. But almost immediately, a contradictory thought emerged that just grew louder and louder and would not be silenced. It was magic. I had to go back. And so I did. I thought it was stupid. I thought it was crazy. I thought it was infinitely stupider and crazier than when I had been going there when there was a potentially crazy homeless squatter. But goddammit, I loved that cemetery. It was a week or so after Halloween. I left at dawn so that I would have as much daylight as possible, though at the time I wasn't even sure of what exactly I meant to do. I parked outside the cemetery instead of inside like I usually do, because that somehow made it easier for me. I stood right in front of the gates for nearly 10 minutes, I think, just trying to muster up the courage to walk back in. I stared inwards, longingly, thinking about how beautiful it was in the morning light. Those titanic trees swaying and creaking softly in the wind. The man had told me that the wisps only appeared on Halloween, when the veil was thinnest. I believed him. I had been to that place over half a dozen times before, and he had resided there for at least a month. Eventually, my curiosity overpowered my fear, and I ventured through the arch. As I stepped in, a profound sense of peace washed over me, an otherworldly tranquility. All graveyards possess this quality to some extent, but this one was more potent. I had never consciously acknowledged it before, but it had always been there, at the back of my mind. There was something else too, the veil, the barrier between our realm and others, and it was noticeably weaker in the cemetery. Once I recognized this feeling, it became apparent that the veil was much stronger now than on Halloween. My cemetery was safe. Relief washed over me, and I laughed, tears flowing freely down my cheeks. In my joy, I fell back onto the ground, making a snow angel in the leaves. I know, it sounds odd. Once I composed myself, I noticed the mess I had left behind. The sandwiches and chips had been claimed by crows, but several candy bars and cooler cans remained scattered around. I found my Bluetooth speaker too, which had surprisingly withstood the elements for a week. And then I spotted the keyring, the keys to the mausoleum, flung to me by the man as his final act, entrusted to me with his dying breath. I felt a pang of shame for forgetting them, for stumbling upon them by accident rather than purposefully seeking them out. Bending down, I gingerly picked up the keys. The man had only shown hostility once when I attempted to force my way into the mausoleum. Yet he chose to pass it on to me, rather than letting it sink into oblivion. What was inside that held such significance to him? I approached the mausoleum, observing it closely. It was made of solid marble, save for the copper grate windows near the top, too high for me to peek through. Above the entrance was a worn carving of a royal couple, but otherwise, it was devoid of any decoration. I unlocked and opened the iron gate first, revealing the green, copper-plated door behind. Leaning in, I listened for any signs of life. I knocked and listened again, hearing nothing. "Hello!" I shouted. "Is anyone in there?" A part of me feared that opening the mausoleum might unleash an ancient evil, but I heard nothing stirring within, so I decided to proceed. I turned the key in the lock and pulled the door open, ready to slam it shut at the slightest hint of danger. The sunlight revealed an empty mausoleum. Instead, my gaze was drawn to a large portrait on the far wall. It showcased an underground realm of sparkling limestone, misty rivers and dazzling blue auroras, with wisps and humanoid figures moving across the crystalline ground. Seated on ebony thrones in the foreground were a king and queen, their glowing blue eyes matching the wisps. A three-headed dog at their feet indicated they were Hades and Persephone. Persephone held an open pomegranate in her right hand, smugly placing a seed into her lips with the left. She seemed to embrace her role as the queen of the underworld. I examined the painting for a few minutes, but my limited knowledge of fine arts didn't help determine its age. Despite its beauty, I wondered why the man hadn't sold it. Resolving to find answers, I explored the rest of the mausoleum. There was a sealed tomb in the center, draped with a purple velvet runner and a wooden chair by its side. The mausoleum also housed a dozen casket niches in the walls, but they only held candles. If this was a place to hold bodies during winter, why was there a sealed tomb in the center? And if this was the man's family mausoleum, why was his ancestor buried outside? A small bookcase under the portrait held several old books. On top was a stack of modern documents and a small safe. One of the keys opened the safe, revealing cash, jewelry, and commemorative coins. I hadn't returned to seek wealth, but knowledge. I grabbed the documents and sat down to read, hoping they'd shed light on recent events. The documents, though lacking names or dates, confirmed the man's story about his family. They were once wealthy, but a series of misfortunes had almost wiped them out. After the latest death, the man had sold off his remaining assets and returned to the cemetery. A note from a psychiatrist mentioned his growing paranoia, his belief in being haunted by vengeful spirits for betraying his family. He planned to seek sanctuary on hallowed ground, hoping to make amends with them. I knew he wasn't crazy. I had seen the wisps and heard music of the underworld. I felt truly sorry for him then, for him to have suffered through tragedy and loss his entire life, knowing that he would be next, and that the best he could hope for was to give himself to them on his own terms. I wished that he was at peace, but from what I had seen so far, I had no assurances of that. I thought about how horrible my newfound gnosis was, to know that there was an afterlife, but for that to offer no comfort and even inspire greater dread than the prospect of oblivion. For the first time in my life, to fear hell. Setting the documents aside, I turned to the bookshelf. I hoped it would offer me some kind of understanding about what I was dealing with. That's when I noticed the first book had a small sticky note attached to its spine. Miss, start here. The man's decision to leave me the mausoleum wasn't as last minute as it seemed, I guessed. I picked up the book and saw that it was a journal of some kind. I opened it, and inserted at the front was a loose leaf table of contents, written in the same hand as the sticky note. Starting with the man's recommendations, I soon realized that the journal had been written by the same ancestor who had made a deal with the elder things in the first place. They described themselves as having been born with a second sight, or clairvoyance. Among other things, it made them aware of spirits. They used this clairvoyance to bootstrap themselves to considerable wealth and social standing. Then, they used their newfound status to seek other gifted individuals and sources of occult knowledge. That's where their collection of arcane literature came from. They developed what modern scientists and philosophers would call a panpsychic theory of consciousness. Consciousness, to them, was a fundamental constituent of reality, like mass or charge. And just like those constants, consciousness did have a direct effect on reality, however minuscule. They came to the conclusion that psychic abilities were the result of being able to focus, amplify, and control these effects. For example, they believed that particles in anything that's not absolute zero are moving, but their movement is random and on the whole, they cancel each other. Telekinesis would be collapsing the wave function of an object, so that all the particles move in the same direction all at once. But that's my take on it. They obviously didn't know anything about quantum physics. They also believed that consciousness became more complex within the bodies of living things, especially the nervous systems of intelligent animals. At some threshold, the organization created by these beings becomes self-sustaining, and an individual's consciousness survives the death of its original substrate. They were certain of this not only because they had seen spirits, but also because they had eventually developed astral projection, the ability to leave their own body. This led them to the discovery that there were other planes of existence besides our own, and that consciousness was not bound to any one of them. During these out-of-body experiences, they discovered a race of beings they called the Elderkin. They thought older peoples had viewed these beings as fae or gods. The man had referred to them as elder things, which I found interesting. Perhaps he just liked Lovecraft. But I'm guessing his experience with them had left him reluctant to think of them as kin. The ancestor, not content with their already considerable gifts and wealth, wanted to know what the elderkin could do for them. Now, I'm going to quote the journal directly. I have learned that if seeking a boon from the rulers of underworld, it is best to do so between the dates of Samhain and Beltane, when the queen is at court. Just as the Greek myths have said, the maiden spends half the year in the summer land with the Earth Mother. When Hades rules alone, he is not inclined towards generosity. Unlike his lecherous brothers, what warmth there is in Hades' heart is for his queen alone. When she is with her mother, he becomes cold and stern, allowing himself to feel nothing, lest he feel the pain of her absence. I have also learned not to pity Persephone. The shades of the underworld tell a different story than the one I've read. They say that, wearying of her eternal maidenhood, and with ambitions that could never be realized in her mother's shadow, it was Persephone that seduced Hades. Whereas Hades rules only because he drew the short straw with his brothers, Persephone believes it is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, and relishes her position as the queen of the underworld. It is to her, then, that I must make my case. If I can appeal to her sense of regal magnanimity, she may grant it, and Hades will defer to her judgment. After that, it reads like a fairly typical Faustian bargain. The man's ancestors selling their eternal soul for earthly prosperity, the only difference being that Persephone demanded their entire bloodline as the price. The ancestor was asking that their gifts pass on without fail to their descendants. I was angry when I read that they accepted this bargain. They sold not only their own soul, but that of every child, grandchild, and great-grandchild they would spawn. Because of their myopic selfishness, my friend wasn't only dead, but condemned to an abysmal afterlife for all eternity. I felt so helpless then. I thought there was nothing that I, as a mere mortal, could do to challenge the will of ancient gods. But then, I had a sudden epiphany. I was clairvoyant. Maybe I had always been and just never realized it. Maybe my time in the cemetery or my exposure to the wisps had changed me. I didn't know, and it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I could sense the veil and spirits, just like the man's ancestor could. I glanced over at the bookshelf and realized that all the knowledge the ancestor had used to hone their skills and grow their power was right in front of me. By then, it was around 5 o'clock. The sun was getting low, and I realized I hadn't consumed anything other than a bottle of water for about 10 hours. I set everything back as I found it, locked up the mausoleum, and headed back to my car. I told myself I needed food and sleep and time to process all that I had learned before committing to anything. But I knew my heart was already set. Just the day before, I wasn't sure if I would ever visit my cemetery again. Now, I was determined to follow through on my plan to move out there permanently, to be closer to the spirits and my hoard of arcane knowledge. I was going to become a witch, and maybe, just maybe, become powerful enough to right something that had gone so terribly wrong. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale, Hallowed Ground, Part 2, by the talented The Vespers Bell. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness, and that you'll carry a piece of the Fearfile Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fearfile Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, so don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night, and stay scared.